Bonjour à toutes et à tous, bienvenue dans notre cycle de conférences Eco2 par EDF, Parlons économie neutre en carbone. Je m'appelle Frédérique Bedos, je suis journaliste, fondatrice de l'ONG d'information Le Projet Imagine et j'ai l'honneur, le privilège de vous accompagner tout au long de ce cycle de conférences en bonne compagnie, en compagnie de Thomas-Olivier Léautier. Bonjour Thomas-Olivier.
Bonjour Frédérique, bonjour à tous.
Alors, si vous me le permettez, je vais commencer par rappeler votre parcours. Vous êtes diplômé de Polytechnique, des Ponts et Chaussées ainsi que du MIT, où vous avez obtenu un diplôme en génie civil et un doctorat en économie. Vous êtes spécialiste des marchés de l'énergie et en particulier de l'électricité, mais aussi du management et de la gestion des risques. Vous avez collaboré avec pas moins de 2 prix Nobel d'économie, Jean Tirole, qui était récipiendaire de ce prix en 2014, et Bengt Holmström, lauréat en 2016. Avant d'accueillir notre invité du jour, je vais prendre juste 1 ou 2 minutes pour vous donner quelques consignes et quelques explications à vous, chers amis du public. Et d'abord, mesdames et messieurs, merci de vous être connectés au LinkedIn Live d'EDF. Je pense véritablement qu'en décidant de passer l'heure et quart qui va suivre avec nous, eh bien, je crois que vous avez vraiment fait le bon choix, car nous avons la chance de recevoir aujourd'hui un invité de très haut vol. Il s'agit du professeur Partha Dasgupta. Ce grand économiste, ce penseur de premier plan, n'est pas assez connu en France, en tout cas pas à la hauteur de l'importance de ses travaux. On parle là d'une pensée révolutionnaire élaborée sur 50 années de recherche. Thomas-Olivier vous en dira un petit peu plus à ce sujet dans un instant. Partha Dasgupta étant indo-britannique, cette conférence va se tenir en anglais. C'est important de le préciser dès maintenant puisque vous le savez, dorénavant, cette conférence, la 3e partie de cette conférence est véritablement entièrement dédiée à vos questions. Et donc, pensez bien à les rédiger directement en anglais, ce qui me permettra de les soumettre donc à Partha Dasgupta, notre invité du jour. Alors, cette fois encore, vous me verrez toujours masqué, puisque, vous le savez, la vague de Omicron, la crise du coronavirus est loin d'être derrière nous. Et en revanche, Thomas-Olivier, vous aurez le droit, sachant que nous sommes très éloignés l'un de l'autre sur ce plateau, de faire tomber le masque au moment de vos prises de parole. C'est la première fois que dans ce cycle de conférences, nous avons un invité qui intervient à distance. Le professeur Partha Dasgupta intervient en direct de l'université de Cambridge et donc je vais m'empresser de l'accueillir et pour cela, je passe maintenant à la langue anglaise. I switch now from French to English in order to welcome you properly, dear Professor Partha Dasgupta. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. My name is Frédérique Bedos. I'm a journalist and I got the privilege to host this cycle of conferences alongside with Thomas-Olivier Léautier. First of all, allow me to introduce you to our viewers by presenting a summary of your background. Professor Partha Dasgupta, you were born in Dhaka, capital of Bangladesh, and you were educated in India, first at Varanasi, then at the University of Delhi, where you studied physics. After that, you studied mathematics at Cambridge, and in 1968, you obtained a PhD in economics. You are now Frank Ramsey Emeritus Professor of Economics at the University of Cambridge and Fellow of St. John's College. You taught in many prestigious places, such as the University of Cambridge, of course, but also the London School of Economics, in the US at Stanford University, in Sweden at the Beijing International Institute of Ecological Economics of Stockholm, in Nepal, as you are a founder member of the Management and Advisory Committee of the South Asian Network for Development and Environmental Economics in Kathmandu, etc., because I can't be exhaustive in this summary. I hope you will forgive me. Throughout the years, you have produced many publications, mainly released in the Cambridge, Oxford, or Harvard Press universities. You have received many prizes, awards, titles, and in 2002, you've been knighted by Queen Elizabeth II. So, Sir Partha Dasgupta, to make a long story short, let's say that your research interests have covered many topics. Let me just mention welfare and development economics, the economics of population, environmental and resource, the economics of undernutrition, and the economics of social capital. In 2019, ahead of the Glasgow COP26 climate summit, the UK government has commissioned you to produce a special report on the economics of biodiversity. You have published this review last year in February, and in your conclusions, you insist on the necessity to introduce a new measure to the global economic accounts, the natural capital. In the light of this brilliant career, I think we can all agree on the fact that you are a leading thinker of our time and that it is an honor to receive you today. Thomas Olivier, do you want to add something on this matter?
Yes, yes, it is an honor indeed. And I just want to point to two very important publications because Professor Dasgupta has revolutionized economics not once but twice. So the first paper is in 1974. The Club de Rome just publishes Limits to Growth, and Professor Dasgupta publishes a paper that incorporates the finite nature of resources in our economy and in the models of growth. So it was a really important paper because it shows how you can account for the finiteness of resources in the economy, and essentially what you do, what was recommended in the paper, is to substitute physical capital, produced capital, for finite resources. And an example of that, it sounds a bit theoretical, but an example of that is what we actually did in France in the 70s, where we actually built nuclear power plants, which is essentially physical capital, to reduce our dependency to oil, which was a finite resource. So that's the first paper. It's a very important paper, and it launched a very extensive literature. The second paper, which is what Frédéric was mentioning and what Professor Dasgupta will expand upon, is the economics of biodiversity. And here, the key insight, at least what I took from it, was that it's not only that resources are finite, is that we are embedded in nature. That if there is no nature, or if nature passes the tipping points, there will be no us, there will be no society, there will be no civilization. And that is a profound transformation of the way we think about growth, of the way we think about our economy. In other words, it doesn't matter how much natural or much physical capital we have, how many factories, how much human capital we have. If we don't have enough natural capital, we have nothing. That's a very, very important point. And Professor Dasgupta, with its review, invites us to engage differently with nature, to engage sustainably with nature, to think, to act, and to measure differently. And that's why we're very proud and honored to hear you talk about now, Professor.
I think that now we are all very impatient to hear you. Professor Dasgupta, the floor is yours.
Following that up, it's very good. It's going to be, everything's going to be a deflator, so to speak. So it's a great pleasure to be with you, and thank you very much for your kind words. So I will be speaking to some major themes that the review of the economics of biodiversity has brought out. I should begin by saying immediately that my criticisms are not leveled at economics. It's a very profound subject. The grammar that we have inherited from our predecessors, our teachers, is profound. I mean, it's just amazing. I'm a completely committed economist. It's only that in recent years, we have been framing economics in a wrong way, particularly in the context of growth and development economics and the economics of poverty. And I want to mention the latter as well. But our forefathers didn't make an error. So I want to make that clear. It's we who have been, my generation have been misled or have been misleading economics. Not so long ago, by which I mean the years immediately following the Second World War, the economic questions requiring urgent attention could safely be studied by excluding nature from formal economic reasoning. As the human economy was small relative to the biosphere, and Europe and Asia needed to rise from the ashes of the war, it made economic sense to focus on the accumulation of produced capital, by which I mean roads, buildings, ports, equipment, machinery, and human capital, health and education. Unfortunately, the resulting macroeconomic models of poverty, growth, and development so directed the way economists in academia, national governments, and international organizations collect and analyze data today, that it has become a commonplace that we can continue to bypass nature, or what we may call natural capital, in our economic models. And I should stress the deep connection between academic economics, ones which our universities produce by our leading thinkers, and the models that are used by international organizations and national governments. Because today's decision makers of the public sector, if you like, are yesterday's students. And today's students will be tomorrow's decision makers at the global or national level. So this interchange between the two is extremely strong. And to break the change is what the review was. I tried to do in the review was to break the change and shift the attention towards including nature, because we happen to inhabit nature. We are embedded in nature. And I want to explore that idea here. The belief that we can ignore natural capital or nature, I'm going to use these terms interchangeably, has been strengthened by the fact that the average person today enjoys a far higher income, is less likely to be in extreme poverty, and lives significantly longer than she did even 70 years ago. I'm going to use 1950 as my benchmark, okay? And for example, since 1950, the global expectancy of life at birth has risen from 46 years to 73 years. And extreme poverty has dropped from more than 60% of the global population to some 10% today. As the first figure shows, if you look at the time series of global GDP in real terms for 2011 prices, from 1750 to 2019, you will see that a sudden spurt took over at about 1950. And global GDP has risen 15-fold in these 70 years to about $130 trillion in purchasing power parity. And if you say, well, oh, that doesn't mean much because we want to look at the standard of living, then if you look at the second figure, please. If I can have the second figure.
There we go.
You will see per capita GDP since 1750, again shows a similar trend. There was a big burst from about 1950, and it has per capita GDP. I'm now only talking global averages, all right? I'm not talking about inequality at the moment, and I'll come back to that later if you want. Then from 1950 to 2019, per capita income has grown five times, to over $17,000 annually, PPP again. And of course, there are now 7.8 billion people, 5.3 billion more people today to enjoy that increase. And you'll see that in the next figure. May I have the next figure, please? That's global population. In 1950, there were about 2.5 billion. Today, there's 7.8 billion and rising, and probably going to taper off to about 10. So that's all the good news. That's the good news. And of course, we have been constantly telling ourselves that there's just a huge future ahead of us, because look at the past, and it's been a secular increase in well-being. But to have continued to ignore nature in growth and development economics, i.e. concentrating exclusively on produced capital and natural capital accumulation, and the economics of poverty has proved to be hopelessly wrong. For nature is our home. We are embedded in nature. And the human economy today is large relative to nature's ability to supply the goods and services we need on a sustainable basis. That's why the blame should not be put on those who developed growth and development economics in the 1950s, maybe even in the 60s. But we have no business to take that on and just restrict ourselves to that, because look at the diagrams I've just now showed. In this lecture, I want first to sketch how contemporary economic thinking can be modified to correct for that mistake. And in fact, I'll concentrate on that throughout. Despite its title, the review of the economics of biodiversity, that's the report that very generously was referred to, is not directly about biodiversity. Instead, it constructs the economics of the biosphere, the whole of nature, of which we are part, so as large a canvas as a social scientist can hope to find. The review conceives the biosphere as a collection of interlinked ecosystems, which differ among one another in their spatial extent. For example, a hedgehog's gut, stomach, is an ecosystem, as is my mouth, by the way. Just as, for example, the tropical rainforest is an ecosystem. So it's the extent, the size, there's an arbitrariness in defining an ecosystem, but never mind, that's not important. What's important is to recognize that there are units of organization which are feeding the biosphere. And in its natural processes, the natural processes operate at different speeds, such as, for example, those which are microseconds long in the case of protozoa, to thousands of years. Ecologists have found that when defined carefully, biodiversity, meaning the diversity of life, contributes to the productivity of ecosystems. That is, their ability to provide us with the multitude of goods and services we need, not just for our enjoyment, but for our very survival. The review thus reduces the economics of biodiversity to the study of asset management problems. So it sees these ecosystems, for example, a wetland or a coral reef or a mangrove forest or a rainforest, as capital assets. So on a par with others, the produced capital and human capital, but more important in the sense that it's primary. Without the universe can survive without machines, can survive without us even, no question about it, okay? And in fact, it did. We weren't here 200,000 years ago, not in the form that we are in now. But nothing can exist without the natural capital. So it's the primary set of capital goods. So the economics of biodiversity is the study of asset management problems faced by as diverse a set of agents as individuals and households, firms, communities, nations, and humanity at large. But that means assessing whether the economic path we are following is sustainable requires a system of economic accounts that keeps a record of an economy's entire stock of assets. Just as, for example, firms, commercial firms, like to have balance sheets. We need to have that, something like balance sheets. But the entire stock of assets that an economy has, and that is the economic's wealth. Of course, when we talk about assets, we think in terms of wealth. It is now a commonplace to call the measure that we need, and the review shows why we need it, inclusive wealth. The qualifier inclusive being added to stress that the measure includes nature. A nation's inclusive wealth, then, to sum up, is the sum of the social worth of its stocks of produced capital, human capital, and natural capital. That wealth should form the basis of economic reasoning is intuitively clear. What we leave behind for our children, and thus for posterity, are assets. But the reason we should be interested in inclusive wealth is that the measure corresponds to well-being across the generations. For it can be shown that when either increases, the other does too. And when either of them declines, so does the other. Wealth and well-being across the generations are, of course, not the same object, but they move in tandem with each other. I want to spend a minute elaborating on this because it's absolutely fundamental to the review, and I'm hoping that it's seen as fundamental to economic thinking. It's become customary now to use whatever measure we think is important and say that's a measure of sustainability. For example, the Human Development Index is one such. GDP per capita is another. Life expectancy is another. Now, these are all telling us something. Of course, they're telling us something. But they don't necessarily go together, by the way. One could go up, the other could go down. What we are interested in at the end of the day is human well-being. At least for this lecture, I'm going to assume that's what we're restricted to. Others might say, well, we ought to include the well-being of other kinds of creatures too. But for our purposes here, let's stick to human well-being. But human well-being when? Today or tomorrow and the after? No, we want to include the whole lot because we care about our children. We care about our children's children because our children care about it, their children. And we know our children's children's children will care about their children. So even though I will not ever meet them, by recursion, I'm interested in them because I care about my children, okay? So each of us has a drive towards looking at our entire dynasty. Of course, we can't predict it, but we have some sense of it. That's why we ask ourselves, what should we leave behind for the future, for our children? Collectively, we ask that same question, and that's what sustainable development is all about. The question is, what should be sustained? And there, I think economics has made a big mistake in concentrating on GDP. The contemporary practice of using gross domestic product, GDP, to judge economic performance is based on a faulty application of economics. GDP is a flow, so many market dollars of final output per year. In contrast to inclusive wealth, which is what I just now mentioned, which is a stock. It is the social worth of the economy's entire portfolio of assets. Moreover, GDP does not record the depreciation of capital assets. An economy could be enjoying high growth rates of GDP even while it destroys natural capital at a furious rate. People living directly on nature would feel the loss, but national accounts would not record it. As a measure of economic activity, GDP is indispensable in short-run macroeconomic analysis and management, but it is wholly unsuitable for appraising investment projects and identifying sustainable development. The founding father of economics asked after the wealth of nations, not the GDP of nations. The idea of wealth that is developed in the review is not surprisingly a lot richer than the one Adam Smith was able to fashion, but his identification of assets as the objects of interest was exactly right. In recent years, much valuable work has been done in estimating movements over time in the wealth of nations. And I'll give you an example in a minute. For example, the ongoing work sponsored by the United Nations Environment Programme based in Nairobi. And I'll give you an example of that in a minute. The key thing here, just to remind you, is inclusive wealth parallels intergenerational well-being, what I was discussing before, and the whole of humanity, as it were, in the future, our expected value of it, if you like, okay? If one goes up, the other goes up. If one goes down, the other goes down. In other words, there's an equivalence between well-being across the generations and the measure of inclusive wealth. So that is why we should be interested in inclusive wealth. It's not an arbitrary measure or index that I've just decided to throw at you. It has a deep philosophical basis. Now, you might say, this is very odd, because on the one hand, we are looking at human well-being, feelings, emotions, state of mind, and so forth, health. And on the other hand, we're looking at capital assets, capital goods, okay? How do they connect so well? They connect by the prices we use to measure these assets. These prices are notional prices. They're not necessarily market prices. In many cases, there won't be market prices, particularly for natural capital. So there is a connection between these two, a deep connection, which is what I've been trying to hint at. Now I want to look at natural capital, the biosphere. The biosphere is a self-regenerative asset, supplying us with a bewildering variety of services, such as climate regulation, decomposition of waste. Never forget that. And then never appears, by the way, in growth models, what we do with the stuff that we produce. It also goes back into the biosphere, and the biosphere has to work hard cleaning it up, by the way, okay? So decomposition of waste, nitrogen fixation, air and water purification, soil regeneration, and pollination. Now, in recent years, we've become accustomed to the thought that nature means climate. And over the years, every time somebody mentioned that I was an environmental economist, they would say, well, you work on climate, don't you? Actually, I've never worked on climate. It was too narrow a problem for me because for reasons I'll mention in a minute, it's just one component of the services, climate regulation, that is only one of the services that Mother Nature provides with us. So these gifts that I just now mentioned, soil regeneration, pollination, and so forth, and the many that I'm unable to list because they remain unknown to us, are today referred to as nature's regulating and maintenance services. Ecologists have defined it that way, identified them and named them that way. They are to be contrasted with provision goods, food, water, timber, fibers, and the non-living material that we use. We have increasingly drawn on nature's regulating and maintenance services to provide ourselves with provisioning goods by mining ecosystems and transforming the landscape, land use change as it's sometimes called. There is thus an inevitable tension between provisioning goods on the one hand and regulating and maintenance services on the other. But regulating and maintenance services are fundamental, for without them, there would be no provisioning goods. So when I speak of a shrinking of the biosphere, I mean a decline in nature's ability to supply regulating and maintenance services caused by our ever-increasing demand for provisioning goods, humanities, that is. And here is the alarming finding. The processes that govern the biosphere's ability to provide regulating and maintenance services are complementary to one another, meaning that if you draw down one such service, for example, climate regulation, sufficiently, you will draw down others in due course, for example, biodiversity. Nature is, to be sure, resilient. It has, after all, evolved over 4.5 billion years. But we humans today are so powerful that we could, if we put our mind to it, bring it down like a house of cards. Recent concerns over global climate change and biodiversity loss are an acknowledgement of that possibility. A characteristic of nature of supreme importance is mobility. The wind blows, the rivers flow, the oceans circulate, and birds and insects fly, which is why and how our activities have consequences that are felt elsewhere and in the future. Moreover, many of nature's processes are both silent and invisible. That makes them easy to overlook until, of course, they're affected so adversely that we become aware of them, as we are currently of the value of biodiversity and climate regulation. We engage in many activities that have deleterious consequences, but for which we are not charged, and over which we have little inner urge to exercise restraint over the use of our oceans, land use changes leading to rising biodiversity loss, and unsustainable carbon emissions are prominent examples. Economists call the unaccounted consequences for others of our actions externalities. Globally, the magnitude of environmental externalities we have inflicted on one another and on our descendants has become gigantic. One study sponsored by UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme, has found that during 1992-2014, produced capital per capita doubled globally, and human capital per capita increased 15%, but natural capital per capita declined by 40%. Can I have the next slide, please? This is very, very interesting figure. Estimates, these are all very rough estimates. The numbers actually don't matter. What really you should believe is the direction of movement. Produced capital per capita doubled between 1992 and 2014. Human capital per capita globally increased by about 15%. Natural capital per capita declined by 40%, which is consistent with what I've been telling you about what's happened in the past 70 years. That is, we've been mining natural capital. That is, we have been degrading the biosphere, converting into the provisioning goods like human capital and produced capital, but of course at the expense of natural capital. But notice that when we look at GDP and so forth as our index of measurement of success, of the success or failure of economies, we ignore the third, natural capital. So we only look at the first two top ones, which is what I was doing right at the beginning with the first three figures. And we say everything is wonderful. But the problem is just like building a house and furnishing it beautifully, artwork and everything. Meanwhile, the floor is being sawn off, if you like, and you haven't noticed it. So the idea is to look at the biosphere as a whole and embed the human economy in it and then see how we're doing. So that's the basic structure. In short, the demand we have been making of nature's goods and services have for some decades exceeded her ability to supply them on a sustainable basis. Because the difference between demand and sustainable supply is met by a diminution of nature, the gap has been increasing, threatening our descendants' lives. We have been collectively damaging nature at an alarming rate, with biodiversity declining faster than any time in human history. Extinction rates of species today are some 100 to 1,000 times the background extinction rate over the past several million years. It is a commonplace today that the biosphere's processes are non-linear, what is less appreciated is that the nonlinearities harbor tipping points beyond which the natural environment would be found to be radically different from the one in which our economies have evolved over the past centuries. COVID-19 has shown us what might be just the tip of the iceberg if we continue overexploiting our nature. Our overreach on the biosphere can be read as an ever-increasing size of the adverse externalities acting on the finite Earth system. This overreach has been made so quickly that the moral language and the institutions we have created over the centuries in the West are inadequate for responding to them. And one of the things that the review tries to do is to produce the grammar, and I'll give you just a sketch of what the outline of where it heads to reconstructing economics, so as to be able to bring these issues into there. Okay, I'm going to complete now with a thought. Having talked about inclusive wealth, and by the way, I should say that nations are now, national governments are now moving in the direction of inclusive wealth. It's not just the United Nations Environment Program. The UK government, for example, has a natural capital unit, which is furnishing the ONS, the National Statistics Office of National Statistics, with asset estimates and so forth. Okay, it's happening in China, it's happening in Costa Rica, New Zealand, and so forth. So that's happening. However, the fact that the overreach of the human economy on nature's ability to supply goods and services is so powerful, we are now in a firefighting situation. I don't want to be over dramatic, but the numbers are really interesting to observe, and we must take them into account. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to concentrate on the demand side, what the demand and supply of nature's goods and services. I've been talking about the overreach, and this diagram, the one in front of you now, is telling us that we have been it's very unbalanced development. Two of the types of capital have been moving up, accumulation, and the other has been decumulating. So there's a stress on the on the biosphere. May I have the next slide, please? I want to concentrate now on the flow, the demand that we make on natural capital, and the supply of natural capital, supply of the goods, of the maintenance and regulating services. Inside the globe, which my team produced to illustrate the ideas in the review, inside the globe is an inequality. So the idea is here, I want to look at the demand we make. As an economist, I want to look at the demand we make on nature's maintenance and regulating services, okay? And the demand is on the provisioning. That's the expressed in provisioning. Now, the provisioning goods measure is, of course, GDP. That's the simplest one to use. So I want to think about GDP. All right, global GDP. But now, global GDP is in final goods and services. So what I want to know is, what is the efficiency with which we transform regulating and maintenance services that Mother Nature offers us into final goods? And that efficiency parameter I'm going to call alpha. So on the left-hand side of this inequality is global GDP, which I'm writing as global population capital N, multiplied by per capita GDP, which I'm writing as small y. So capital N times small y is global GDP divided by the efficiency parameter alpha. And that has to compare, that's the demand we are making of Mother Nature's regulating and maintenance services. But what about the supply side? So I want you to think of the supply of these services as dependent on, of course, the health of the biosphere. So I'm going to call the health of the biosphere, or the size of the biosphere, as capital S, and capital G is a function of that, okay? And where we are, the higher the S, the higher the G. It's like a fishery, let us say, okay? The stock of fish and the reproductive, the regenerative rate of the fishery. Okay, now can I have the next slide, please? And the inequality says the demand exceeds supply. Oh, well, this one is about the same as this, but let's stick to this. Right at the top is the inequality. Currently, demand exceeds supply, but how much by? Well, one estimate has it, and it's about as good as an estimate we have, is that the ratio between the left-hand side and the right-hand side is about 1.6. In other words, demand overstrips supply of maintenance and regulating services by a factor of 1.6, which, metaphorically speaking, would be to say we need 1.6 Earths if we want to have this demand met on a sustainable basis. Remember, sustainable basis is extremely important. By sustainable, I mean that capital S remains constant. Otherwise, of course, this inequality can be maintained for a while because we draw more and nature deteriorates. Capital S declines, G declines, and so the gap increases even more. But these nonlinearities suggest that we could come to a tipping point where further decline would mean catastrophe of some kind. Maybe it'll be local catastrophe, some regional catastrophe, but it'll be some kind of catastrophe. And you can see the parallel of this idea in discussions on global climate change, where people worry, or scientists are telling us 2 degrees above pre-industrial revolution, mean global temperature. Above that, 2 degrees above that is about as much as we can bear. If it's 4 degrees, all hell is going to break loose. Now, bear in mind, this is extremely important. We've had a very stable climate. We had a stable biosphere for about 15, 20, 30,000 years or so, roughly speaking. And that's when our human civilization has grown. And so we have had a rather narrow window over it. If circumstances had been different, perhaps we would have adapted to it. So somebody might say, well, look, all right, so what happens if it's 4 degrees? We'll adapt to it. The problem is much of our infrastructure is fixed. It's not malleable. That's the problem. And one indication of non-malleability is our own experience. It's very hard to change. So all the infrastructure, all the roads and buildings and so forth, those are, if they're under threat, we have a problem. That's a serious thing. Now, in the review, and I will stop there, the idea is to look at this inequality because, as I say, it's that we're in a firefighting situation. So while governments surely should be concerned with inclusive wealth and see how to change policies in such a way that inclusive wealth per capita increases rather than declines, here, for our purposes here, I want to concentrate on one component of it, which is the global impact inequality. Okay. Now, when you stare at this, you can see there are 5 variables, N, Y, alpha, G, and S. So obviously policies need to, if you want to reduce this inequality and make it into an equality, to bring them together and make them equal, then of course, either the left-hand side has to come down or the right-hand side has to go up, or both. Look at the right-hand side. Well, the idea would be nature-based investment, recovering torn biosphere, recovering restoring, regenerating the wetlands, regenerating coral reefs, and so forth. That's the kind of thing. On the right-hand side, that's investment. But it's important to remember that investing in nature means mostly waiting, leave her alone, and let her regenerate. So bear in mind, when I use the word investment, the intuition behind investment is very different. Investment in building roads immediately brings to mind what? Drills, big machinery and so forth. All the stuff you see people in hard hats working away. But increasing investment in capital S could mean simply waiting, planting trees, and so forth. On the right-hand side, on the left-hand side, of course, one possibility would be to increase alpha. And the economics of climate change directs attention precisely to that. Moving to clean energy is another way of saying we're going to use less of nature's maintenance and regulating services to provide us with energy by shifting to, let's say, wind farms or solar energy and so forth, because that's increasing alpha. And since alpha is the denominator, if alpha can be increased, then the left-hand side would decline, other things equal, of course. A second would be small y. And I'm not going to discuss policy at the lecture because I'm going to now finish. At Q&A, you could ask me, how, if you like, we could have a discussion on the ways by which we can think about policy in the light of the global impact inequality. I think I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, dear Professor Partha Dasgupta. It was absolutely a fascinating lecture, which is in a way is the result of a lifetime achievement. So Thomas Olivier, can you share with us your first reactions?
Yes, of course. Professor Dasgupta made it sound so simple and so elegant, and just one equation that summarizes everything. But I want to first make an observation for the readers, the public who may not have read the review, and then ask a question. So the review, in fact, is an incredible work in terms of its breadth and its depth. In terms of breadth, it goes from the classical economics, the mathematical models, which are fairly sophisticated, that we use to model growth and the size of the economy. It also includes some references to philosophy. I was reading yesterday, and there was some quote by Aristotle. And also there's countless examples of case studies of different solutions that have been tried, some successful and some unsuccessful. So it is very broad and also very deep, because in each of those topics it goes very deep. And I think it's a piece of work that students will study for years to come to appreciate its insights. And that leads me to my first question. Of course, some of those ideas were, and in particular the inclusion wealth, some of those ideas were already practiced or published by other economists, and of course there was your work on finite resources. How are we doing with transforming what is being taught today to the students, what the research agenda is? How are we doing? Because as you correctly mentioned in the introduction, what we teach today as academic economics is what will practitioners, government officials will do tomorrow. So how do you think our profession as economists is doing in terms of absorbing your findings and reversing the current course of action in terms of thinking? I don't know if my question is clear enough.
Of course it is, and it's very kind of you to ask, because it sort of bothers me a lot. The review has had an astonishingly good reception. I just can't believe it. I'm overwhelmed. The government, the Treasury, kept my team on for 11 additional months after the team disbanded only at the 31st of December. So from 2nd of February to the 31st of December last year, the team continued, in a smaller version, of course, to help me disseminate it, because there were huge numbers of requests being made from all sorts of people for Q&As, interviews, lectures like this one, and panel discussions and so forth. And that'll continue into the future too, but it was really concentrated. I think I've taken part in now over 250 events in these 11 months. I was fully at work, yeah, so that was good. However, what the people who were, there's a supply side. There was a demand and the supply. We could supply, but unless people approached the Treasury. There was business schools who were very interested. I met with deans of, there was 2 such meetings where the deans of business schools asked precisely the question that you were asking about how to translate this into economic courses and so forth. And I had students in mind when I wrote the review, by the way, the 600-page one, the full one, the one you were referring to. And I prepared a 100-page one without any mathematics for the citizen. It's like that. So there were business schools, there were parliamentarians, CEOs of companies, lots of them, bankers, government officials, international organizations. No economics department, absolutely none. The only exception, there was one exception, but it wasn't an economics department, was Ned Phelps, Professor Edmund Phelps of Columbia. He wanted me to address one of his graduate courses. And of course, he was very interested in it, that's why he asked. But no formal approach. So that doesn't suggest to me very great promise. And I don't know how that can be shifted to economics departments, of major universities. Otherwise, there is plenty of my kind of economics, the economics I mentioned in environmental and resource departments, special departments, environmental departments in the universities, forestry schools and so forth, but not centrally in economics. I should say, though, and finally, to respond to your question, the Cambridge University Press will be publishing the entire review in the next 4 or 5 months. Even though the review is free of charge, available on the internet of the Treasury, but CUP wants to use this opportunity to do that, so students can actually have a hard copy if they wish to. I should say, however, as a final remark, that it wasn't that easy to for economists to absorb the inclusive wealth notion. The theorem that shows the equivalence between wealth and inclusive wealth and social well-being, which is what I talked about, was published in 2000, year 2000, in a paper that I produced with Carl-Johan Mailer. It came out in 2000. The late Kenneth Arrow was very quick in absorbing it. And then he and Mailer and I published a series of papers together extending the theorem to many other kinds of situations. But the theorem is solid, okay? This was 2000 when the first paper came out, and with Ken Arrow, 2004, 2005, a series of papers, theoretical papers, looking at various aspects of it and so forth. In 2009, I received a letter from a very distinguished economist saying that the jury is still out about the theorem. Now, this is a theorem, and I used to think that a theorem is a theorem. There's no, unless there's something wrong about the theorem, proof is wrong, that's okay, I understand that. But evidently, there is a problem. I don't know why, but there we are.
Well, thanks for your answer. That is amazing, because I read some of the papers that came afterwards, the Hill and Kickstrom paper that refers to the theorem, and it seems to be well established. It's a bit technical. I mean, it's hard math, but it is a theorem, right? It does work. So it's a pretty scary thought that none of our colleagues, as professors of economics, are embracing the fact that you see so eloquently put. Do you want to have questions for the public, or are we ready for Q&A? Off we go.
I think we can do that, and whenever you want, you can still exchange, of course, and go further than the questions from the audience. We can do something really diverse. So we have already received many questions for you, Partha Dasgupta. Is there not a need for a difference in approach between rich countries and poor countries on the economics of biodiversity? Example, how to replace excessive exploitations that harms biodiversity, but which is just for survival in very poor regions?
Terrific question, and thank you for asking, because of course I spend a lot of time in the review discussing it. You're quite right. But the first cut into this question could be, the poor countries can't afford this. They need to develop, all right? This is what I've heard for 40 years, actually, believe me. So that's the first response. And of course, that's a wrong way of thinking about it, because it's not an accident, just to give you an illustration, it's not an accident that the world's richest biodiverse regions are in the tropics. And it's also not an accident that some of the world's poorest countries are in the tropics. Sub-Saharan Africa is the metaphor for this combination of poverty and a very rich biodiverse source, and the Amazonia is another. Okay, so contrary to what one might think, Mother Nature is extremely important for the poor people because their lives depend on it. If you go into a coastal fishery in Africa, their central attention is on the fishery. That's their survival strategy. People, indigenous population who live in forests, that's their home, their sacred home even, okay? So the issue that nature is a luxury, that what we need to do is to develop and then clean up the environment, which is the metaphor that was used up to about 2000, year 2000, in such publications as The Economist, constantly saying that, there is this like a kind of a Kuznets curve, that, when you're poor, you pollute like crazy because you need to grow. And then when you're rich enough, you can afford to worry about, the comforts of life. And then you invest in pollution regarding. The problem is that was a wrong metaphor, that was the whole point of my talk, is saying that if you're really degraded it, she may not be able to recover. Okay, so that's very important. But to come down directly to the fundamental question that you've asked, what's happening is that the trade system is actually damaging. The extent to which we applaud globalization and free trade it's really very bad economics. This is nothing to do with politics, by the way. I mean, I'm not left, right, or center. I just believe in doing good economics. The idea that free trade is efficient and optimal is based on a theorem which assumes that every commodity has a perfect market price. Now, the whole point about this lecture and my review was that a heck of a lot of these goods, Mother Nature's goods in particular, don't have any markets because they're open access. They're free for use, okay? So in that kind of a context, to say free trade is a good thing for poor countries is really very perverse. Here's an example. You have a poor country, very poor country, with a rich biodiverse forest in the highlands. And so that country is encouraged to export, raise funds to develop, to accumulate produced capital and human capital. That's the standard story from the World Bank, World Trade Organization, you name it, okay? Now, so they do it. So they start cutting down the forest and export it to, say, England or China or America, as the case might be. The problem is that cutting a forest has external consequences. Internal to the country, by the way, but external to the forest itself. There will be landslides, there will be soil degradation, there will be you name it. You know about what the problems are. But that external cost, the externality that downstream residents are suffering from, will not be included in the export price. Which means what? Which means that wealth, in my sense, inclusive wealth, is being transferred free of charge, is moving from the poor country to the rich country. I mean, that's absurd. I mean, it shouldn't happen. So indeed, it's extremely important now for poor countries, those who are supplying primary products to rich countries. And there's the only way they can develop themselves. It is required that they protect them and to charge higher prices. So the correct thing would be for poor countries to have a cooperative, to have an export tax on their thing. We pay more, that is. And we should pay more because we're paying too little for the goods that we consume. That's the whole point about this, the impact inequality. So I'm very pleased you asked that question, because the idea that this way of thinking runs against poverty alleviation is just the opposite. When I include inclusive wealth, I mean the inclusive wealth of the poor people too. And if their lives are more embedded in nature, that will be a bigger component in their wealth than for you and me, who most of our wealth is in the form of non-natural capital. I don't know if that makes sense, but I could speak for hours on this one.
I can imagine, of course, it's about correcting the blind spots of all our economic activities. But you will see the next question is very interesting too. I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. You are an academic, but if you could share some suggestions to politics, what will be, in your view, the 3 top priorities?
Well, in one sense, at the global level, this lecture that I've just now given to you, because of brevity, I restricted myself to the global point of view. Everything was on averages. I didn't talk about inequality, poverty, and so forth. But even within the global context, I did talk about a priority, namely the impact inequality. I said, we are in a firefighting situation. So globally, we ought to be concerned with the impact inequality. So now let me give you one illustration of how we can proceed from that observation. It's in my review, but I think it will appeal to you. So we have the open oceans, open seas, that is the oceans beyond the 200-mile exclusive economic zones, okay? That's about 65 to 68% of the Earth's surface. It's a gigantic biome. Without the oceans, we'll be out, sunk, okay? And yet, it's free. It's open access. It belongs to nobody, and so we think it belongs to everybody. And of course, it does in some deep sense. It's, humanity has control. We don't pay for using it. And yet, trillions of dollars of goods are transported annually across these great oceans. The Pacific, you've seen them, these huge container ships. Oil is transported, you name it, okay? And then there are cruises, pleasure cruises, everything. Nobody pays for the right to do the crossing. So it's a commodity which is free. On top of that, there is this fishing industry, which is the deep sea fishing and so forth, okay, and mining. On top of that, the third, we dump pollutants in it, and nobody is there to charge, okay? So leave that aside. So it's a global commons. So leave that aside for the moment. Then we have a global public good in the form of, let us say, the tropical rainforests in the Amazon, the Congo, the tropical rainforests of Malaysia, Indonesia, and many others. Okay, they are global public goods. They're supplying all these regulating and maintenance services, not all, but contributing to that. So a whole of humanity benefits. On the other hand, they are, however, housed within national jurisdiction. So you contrast these two types of public goods, Mother Nature's public goods, not Mother Nature-related public goods. One is open access and the other is private property, if you like, national property. Now, we complain about the deforestation taking place in Amazonia and so forth. We, when I say I do, certainly. And I dare say everybody else does when they read that the size of Portugal is being cut down every year. Okay, that's a really troublesome word. On the other hand, they could say that, look, it's all very well for you to complain, but it's a global public good. This is applying us all. Why should we be responsible for the whole of humanity? So the natural thing to think about is we should pay them for the ecosystem services that these forests are offering. And at the national level, this is happening all the time now, more increasingly. Payment for ecosystem services. It's happening in England, UK, it's happening in Costa Rica, China, and so forth. I won't go into it, but the idea is to pay for the services that somebody else owns the asset and is offering me the service, and I pay for that, okay, to protect it. That gives the incentive to protect it. Now, if I come back to these two huge biomes, the natural thing would be to charge for the use of the oceans. And we could be raising billions, by the way. When I say we, I mean humanity. And one of the suggestions in the review is that the United Nations, perhaps we ought to have a new institution within the United Nations, charged with the protection and preservation, conservation, and charging for the use of these global public goods, which are Mother Nature's. If we could raise billions out of that, that could be used to fund, for example, the payment for ecosystem services at the international level. And that's a clear-cut recommendation in our thing because it comes from very simple economics, literally simple, the simplest first-year economics, okay? It's not on the agenda of COP27, COP26, COP15. It's nowhere to be seen. So we have a long way to go.
Yes, this is very this is very ambitious what you're talking about, and you mentioned the fact that we need a supranational institutions to take care of that. That's what you mean.
It's not that ambitious when you think about it. What happened at the end of the Second World War? What happened in 1948-49? The United Nations was founded. The World Bank, IMF, and subsequently WHO. These were far-sighted political leaders who felt things needed to happen. And they were supplying public goods. The World Bank does, the IMF does. And yet we are now so timid. I don't know why.
There is another question from the audience. And first of all, it begins with the appreciation of your lecture, because it begins with very interesting indeed. How do we best get leaders to understand and make the changes required with a sense of urgency? People still seem to focus on short term at the expense of the longer term. And that's what you're talking about with the GDP, for example, which is really a good measure for the actual activity. But then we need to have the long run vision. That's what you mean.
I really don't know how to answer that. It's something that really bothers me, obviously, as you can imagine, as it bothers you, the question there, and everybody else. I have no idea how to fix this. I wrote the review in part for graduate students, because I'm hoping that it would, the full text. But the other I wrote for the citizen, the average person, people I know and people I meet who are not economists, some of whom have never been to university, but they're wise people and worry about their grandchildren. Now, this is a commonplace thing. We all worry about, at my age anyway, we worry about our grandchildren, and younger people worry about their children, okay? That's the long run, if you like, because if you really care about your children, you do care about your grandchildren by recursion, something that I suggested before. We want them to have a happy life. And we know one of the components probably that they will have a flourishing set of children and so forth. It's a collective action problem. That's what you're pointing to. I don't know how to solve it. It's except for we citizens need to just bang on about it. And I think the right way to do it is, the right start is at the community level. And I see a lot of community action, at least in the United Kingdom, at least in Cambridge, for example. And you tend to your community landscape, parks, little walkways, trees, and so forth. Now, I know that's small beer compared to what we've been discussing globally and so forth. But all these small beers add up to this big beer. You see what I mean? So I think that's the way to do it. And each of us has his own limitations and talents, and we have children to raise or careers to make. So obviously we can't spend all our time over it, but maybe a little bit of time given to some local activities. And then you meet people, and then maybe a little article in the newspaper and so forth. That's the best we can do. And then there'll be some of us, and not me, but some of us who have access to, who want to enter into politics and try and change things there and make compromises there and so forth. I can't tell. That's about as far as I can go to trying to explain what our role as citizens can be. I personally work only at the small level. I don't have access to the big level. The written word, I have access to the written word, obviously. But
yeah, Professor, I have a follow-up question which you raised earlier in your discussion, which is about the impact inequality. So on the left-hand side, there's the size of the population, there's the GDP per capita, and one of the questions that actually motivated us to run this conference cycle is, can we have infinite growth? Can we have an infinite size of the economy? Can we have infinite growth in the GDP per capita? Or is it that your view is that because the economy is bounded, the nature is bounded, little y will be bounded, and we won't grow the GDP per capita, but we might grow the wealth, inclusive wealth. So can we grow the economy forever, or are we stuck somehow, somewhere?
Thank you very much. This is a great question, and I do raise it in the book, and in chapter 4 star, I give an answer. Chapter 4 actually give an answer. Okay, can I have that last slide back again, please? The inequality slide. That's just, no, yes. The one before.
The one before.
Number 7 will do. No, I'm sorry.
The one
number
before
6.
again, yeah. There we go.
Okay, this one. Okay. This one? Now, one of the things is that, remember I remarked on the fact that one of the crucial maintenance and regulating services that Mother Nature offers us, by the way, they're all crucial, so I shouldn't have said one of the crucial. One of the regulating and maintenance services that Mother Nature gives us is decomposition. So whatever we produce then goes back onto Mother Earth, and then there's a recycling mechanism, as it were, of the decomposers of waste and so forth. Okay, that's included in the impact inequality, because it's not just GDP. What happens to the GDP, the output, when it's waste, and so the alpha includes the ability of nature to convert that into recyclable material, so that the biosphere remains a regenerative asset. Okay. So the thing is that one of the things I discovered with extensive discussions with ecologists was alpha is bounded above. Now the natural idea is that, what about human ingenuity? We should be able to make alpha rise as much as we can through human ingenuity. That's called technological progress. So if you like the technological, remember, I should say, these parameters, they're not parameters, they're variables, and of course they're related to each other. I haven't written down a growth model, a dynamic model. And in the review, there is a full dynamic model which shows you how to get this inequality out of one of the equations, which is to do with the regenerative rate of the biosphere. Okay, So the difference between demand and supply is the rate at which the biosphere is declining, the rate at which the stock S is declining. So that's a dynamical equation there. All right. So, and these are all related to each other, in the form of coupled differential equations, if you like. All right. So now the question is, what about alpha? The idea here is that all the growth models that we have written down so far, all the in my chapter 4 star, what I do is, after having shown this the dynamical model that I haven't written down here, I showed what is an implicit assumption in all the growth models that we have, which of course is the basis on which the question has been raised. And that is that alpha in principle can go to infinity. If alpha can go to infinity through our human ingenuity, then of course in principle ny can go to infinity. No problem about that, so long as it keeps the ratio could be kept intact to nothing, not to exceed G of S. All right. Here's the problem. Alpha cannot go. It'll violate ecological principles. All right. So there's always a leakage. It's not quite the second law of thermodynamics. It's much more at a more coarser level. Alpha, no matter how much you invest in technological change, in ideas, education, and so forth, alpha, even in the long run, is bounded above. Given that, capital NY is bounded above because G is bounded, and the Earth is finite. That's the finiteness of Earth is on the right-hand side. The left-hand side, the inequality is where we can manipulate Mother Earth's services for our purposes. So yes, you cannot have indefinite growth in the way we now think in terms of material goods and services, capital N times small y. What does it say about the future? Does it mean we have to go for degrowth? I'm not suggesting that at all. And the reason I'm not suggesting is we have a serious problem of institutional problem in the world where so much of Mother Nature is free. I've given you just an example of the open oceans and the rainforests. So if we can get our institutions right so that we pay for what we use, notionally, of course, because many of these things will not be marketed, but it'll be done through taxes or whatever, okay? If we do that, then the entire direction of technological change will change. It will be towards nature-conserving technological change as opposed to labor-saving technological change, which has been what's been happening. If you think about it, what's the entrepreneur to do? If there's a lot of free nature, why would you wish to develop nature in technologies which save on nature? It would be insane. You want to save labor costs or produce capital costs. So what you do is you become rapacious. All the technologies are rapacious towards nature. The chainsaw, for example, fantastic thing from the labor point of view. Damn bad news for Mother Nature, because you sort of wipe out forest, acres and acres and acres of forest in a blink of an eye. So the direction of technological change will be altered enormously because the incentive structure will change. I can't predict what lies ahead in 100 years' time. For all I know, our great-great-grandchildren will have better lives, far more satisfactory lives for themselves, because they will see a different world. Just as 100 years ago, our grandparents, great-grandparents wouldn't have predicted our lifestyle. It was completely new, okay? So I would, on the whole, avoid discussions of degrowth and so forth. I mean, this sort of muddies there because it's basically half-baked. The thing is, concentrate on the economics here. And what we need to do is to really get our institutions right. And institutions doesn't mean more markets, by the way. Communities develop the communitarian management processes, depending on the scale of the environmental problem that you have. National level, international level, and I spoke on the international level here today. But once we do that, we'll be moving in a different direction. Of course, there will be some costs, goes without saying, initial cost. I mean, if I have to start paying for all the stuff that I'm using free of charge, my real income is going to go low with the fall, goes without saying. But that will be a defendable one, because previously I wasn't paying for what I was consuming. It's like stealing from the supermarket. You don't allow to do that. And suddenly somebody says, no, we're going to have guards out there so that, the pilfering is going to be reduced. Do we complain? We don't. We say it's right. So likewise here, I think we ought to have that in mind. that kind of a framework in mind to see the efficacy of institutional change. I don't know if that makes sense, but
no, it sure does.
That's the best I can do.
It sure does.
Time flies very quickly, so I'm going to mix two questions. You've been very clear on the fact that as a citizen, as individuals, we've got to commit into all of this. So there is a question from the audience. Do you think there are enough Greta Thunberg all around the world, first of all? And did you ever encounter a culture or a country in particular that are balancing well natural, produced, and human capital? Do you have such examples in your mind?
I can't answer the second question because I don't know enough of national statistics. It would be foolhardy on my part. All I can say is that some countries, the political leaders are more vocal about these issues. That doesn't mean they're translated into better policy. I don't know. I just couldn't. Can I have the first part of the question again, please?
Do you think there are enough Greta Thunberg all around the world?
Greta what?
Greta Thunberg. You know the Swedish young woman, the young activist?
Well, yes, of course they are. I mean, I think there are quite a lot. In fact, there have been many young people at least in South Asia, who have been politically engaged, but their power is limited, except that now the power is increased by the social media enables you to have them. I think it's altogether very, very promising, very good. It sort of concentrates minds.
According to you, has nothing concretely been done since 2000 on the subject of integration of sustainability by governments? From 2000?
Oh, look, I wouldn't say that, because I did say that in several countries. Look, the idea that we should have natural capital accounts is essentially post-2000. That's not a question, no question. But as far as I can judge, because countries like India didn't even have the faintest idea about wealth. I was asked to chair a commission which reported to the Indian government in 2013 on inclusive wealth, to redo the national accounts. By the time I began in 2010, I guess it was, most of my committee members who came from the government didn't know what we were talking about even. So yes, but the idea of having natural capital accounts, that is quite accepted now. That's not an issue in many countries. As I said, England has it, Costa Rica, New Zealand, China. That's not a problem. I don't see that as a problem. But the problem is whether it's a peripheral part of the Office of National Statistics. And my fear is that unless these kinds of issues are taken seriously, they'll remain peripheral. And the attention will constantly be over GDP growth. And it's happening. If you read The Economist, is a very good sign of polished thinking without too much expertise. And that's what, The Economist newspaper, the weekly, is a very good example of very sophisticatedly written thinking, but rather shallow economics, in my judgment, particularly over natural capital. They can't just get their head around the fact that really we need to think of assets and the missing markets, all the missing prices. Not markets is not the right word, missing institutions, which will price them in a way such that our individual incentives to consume will be in line with the common good. As of now, of course, our incentives are very non-aligned with the common good. That's called externalities.
Exactly. We had an amazing example of quick response to a situation with COVID-19. Locking people from months has rebuilt nature value. Couldn't we imagine wide times every year to rebuild nature value? This is quite extreme, but maybe it's necessary. What do you think about that?
Well, what a good idea. Absolutely. We should, yeah.
Like time out, every single year for a few months so that the biosphere can regenerate itself. Maybe this is a sacrifice we should do.
And we could help it to go along. And I think the thought that I was expressing, that we should work at the community level, because that's where most of us inhabit the space in which we have, is, I think, absolutely sound. I mean, you know, it's just remarkable how many of our neighbors are involved in creating green space within the environment here of Cambridgeshire. It's very nice. And this could be replicated. It's very easy. It's, you know, a few hours a week of work, digging the soil and cutting the weeds out, and getting rid of the lawns and allowing wildlife to flourish is something which at the global level doesn't mean anything, but I think it does. If you add up all the locals, that becomes the global. So I think I would like to encourage that. I don't feel embarrassed in not having been able to influence global thinking, because it's not very bad. I can do the best I can, and if it works, if people listen to it, that's good. If they don't, I'm not going to have sleepless nights.
So I don't know if you know the concept, because I don't. Do you agree with the half-Earth concept? Is it achievable and is it sufficient? Do you know about this half-Earth concept?
I think you use only half the Earth, but...
I suspect it's degeneration of the biosphere. Yeah. I would imagine, I can't imagine otherwise. And of course it's the right thing. I mean, that G of S, we want to increase S. We don't want to, we're basically cutting down S like crazy. We forget how agricultural development has encroached on Mother Nature's ability to supply us with maintenance and regulating services. Because farmland is has been extending. I mean, England has very, very little biodiversity left. And it's been happening for 2,000 years, so it's not exactly a new story, by the way. Maybe even before, not enough. But as of now, we need to reclaim, and there are some attempts at trying to do that.
Thank you so much, Professor Partha Dasgupta. It was absolutely amazing to be able to exchange with you today. As usual, time flies too quickly. It's already the time to conclude. It was a real honor, of course. So many thanks to all of you, dear friends of the public. Thank you for your active participation and your trust. This conference will be very quickly available in replay on YouTube. So Partha Dasgupta, you can use it also, and you can share it all around you, of course. And voila, it will be available as soon as the French subtitles will be ready. In February, Thomas, Olivier and I, we will receive another brilliant economist. She's a woman, she's from Belgium. Her name is Estelle Cantillon, and she's one of the most brilliant economists of her generation. She will explain to us how to decarbonize the economy in a holistic and bottom-up way. That's a correct way to say it?
That is absolutely correct.
So don't miss it. It will be the last conference of our cycle just before the closing ceremony, which will be particularly prestigious, of course, but it's not the moment to describe you this further because it's important to keep some suspense, you know. So in the meantime, please take a very good care of yourselves. See you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Professor.